We're learning Mishnah's Yevamos, Perek Beis, Chapter 2, Mishnah Mishnah 5. Okay. Mi sheyesh lo ach mikamakim. Excuse me. If someone dies and he has a brother of any kind, now, what it means is like this. It's a continuation from yesterday. A person has a brother who's a mamzer. He has like we say, Yibam, the mitzvah of Yibam, is from your brother, from your father. Any brother from your father, even if that brother is a mamzer, that's what it means here. Whoever has a brother, that means a person died without children, and he has a paternal brother, mikamakim, in any manner, which means even if that other brother is a mamzer, that means his father to mamzer. That brother will necessitate yibam for his wife's brother. If a person passes away without children, then his brother has a mitzvah of yibam. Even if that brother is a mamzer, that brother has now a connection of yibam to the brother's widow. And he's going to have to, and as we learned yesterday, he's going to have to give her chalitza. He can't do yibam because he can't marry her, but he has to do chalitza. And he's considered his brother in all matters. This means to include that if, let's say, a person passes away and his only remaining heir, his only remaining relative to inherit him, is his brother, and that brother is a mamzer, that brother will inherit him. If, let's say, we're talking about a case of a Kohen has a brother who's a mamzer, and that brother who's a mamzer dies, the halacha is a Kohen cannot go to a funeral, right? He can't come into contact with a dead body in any form. But for a close relative like a brother, he's allowed to go to the funeral. He's allowed to make himself impure in order to fulfill his obligation of mourning to his brother. That includes even a brother who's a mamzer. So the first part of the point of the Mishnah here is that even a mamzer is considered your brother. I mean, he's the child of your father. So he is your brother from your father, and all the halachas, all the laws that apply to a brother from a father apply to him. Chutz. The exception to this rule is, the exception is if, let's say, this brother, or this biological brother, we'll say, was born from a shivcha, from a non-Jewish slave woman. I should say non-Jewish, from a slave woman. Okay, the halacha is that if a Jew fathers a child from a slave woman, what's the status of the child? The child has the status of a slave. And therefore, if it's a child has the status of a slave, it's halachically not considered your child. So therefore, if he has a brother, I'll call it a biological brother, because his father fathered a child, a boy, from a maidservant, from a slave woman, and we mean a slave woman, a woman that was a slave to another Jew. Mm-hmm. That child follows her, not him, not the father. And therefore, if that's your brother, then that brother is not really considered your brother, and all the laws regarding a brother don't apply to him. Or it's kachavim. Let's say the child is born from a non-Jew. The woman's not Jewish. There again, the child doesn't follow the father's status, it follows the mother's status. The child's not Jewish. If the child's not Jewish, then halachically it's not considered a brother. So the first part of the Mishnah is talking about brothers. What's considered a brother, what's not considered a brother. Now, in a similar vein, the next Mishnah continues. Someone who has any kind of child. Okay, the whole mitzvah of Yibam is if a person dies without children. So, what's called a child regarding this? Or what's called a son or a child? A person who has a son or a child mikamakim in any way, Paiter Eishes Aviv min Yibam. He now exempts the wife of his father from Yibam. Why? Because the father had a child. Yibam is only a mitzvah of Yibam if a person dies childless. But if, let's say, he had a son, okay? He had a son, and the son was a mamzer. from a woman he wasn't supposed to have a child with, but he had his child that was a mamzer, and now so that he's the child, he's the child of that person. That person has a son who's a mamzer, or even a daughter who's a mamzer mamzeres in this case, and then he dies, and then he dies. Does his wife need yibum? No. The man has a child. As long as the man has children, there's no mitzvah of yibum. And that child is going to be liable for either striking his father or cursing his father. The Torah says, you curse your father, you strike your father, carries the death punishment. So any child, even if the child's a mamzer, that child has an obligation to respect the father. And if the child were to strike or curse the father, that child would be liable to a death penalty. And it's his son for all matters. If he's the only heir, if he's the only son to inherit, he's going to inherit everything because it's your son. Also, if we're talking about a Kohen can make himself impure. If a Kohen's son passes away, the Kohen can go to the funeral. The Kohen can become impure from the dead body for a close relative like a son. Well, if that son was a mamzer, the Kohen can make himself tummy for him. Except if he has a child from a slave woman or from a non-Jewish woman. Because as we said before, in both those cases, the child is not considered your child. The child follows the lineage of the mother in those cases, and therefore the child is not considered. It's considered either a slave, which is a pseudo-Jew, or meaning a slave has some mitzvahs that they're obligated in doing, and if they be freed, they're considered like a full-fledged convert. But again, the status of the child of the slave woman is the child has the status of a slave, and therefore it's not your child. Or if it's from a non-Jewish woman, it's not your child, and therefore whatever laws there are regarding a father and a child would not apply to that child. Okay. Now, the Chofetz Chaim, we began learning the Chofetz Chaim how he said that if you want to bring someone into your life, either through a partnership, you want to work on your house, you want to make a shidduch with them, you want to marry, you want to consider marrying your child to their child, you're allowed to start asking questions about them, even though the person you're asking about may tell you something negative, because your intent is not to put the person down, but to find information to protect yourself. Okay, now, nonetheless, he says, Ach nirali. So it says the Chofetz Chaim, it appears to me that when you ask someone about that person, that you let him know that you want to, again, make a shidduch, you want to consider marriage between your children, or you want to make some kind of a partnership with him. And then there'll be no suspicion of forbidden. Meaning, imagine you want to find out about a person. So you go over to somebody and say, hey, you know so-and-so? What do you say about him? You don't tell them why you're asking. If you just walk over to someone and you say, hey, tell me about so-and-so, that looks like Lashon Hara. And he's just answering your question. You want to know about him? I'll tell you about him. That's Lashon Hara. So you have to let the person know, says the Chofetz Chaim, why are you asking? Why are you asking? You're asking because you need information, because you want to hire him for something, let's say. Oh, and by doing that, it takes off any kind of suspicion that you're doing something wrong. Not because of the question, meaning not because of the inquiry. His intention is not to put him down, but it's only for his own benefit, as we have explained. Now, in the parentheses, he has something very important. The Chofetz Chaim is going to elaborate on this later. But let's say you're asking something about someone, and you're allowed to ask, he's allowed to reply. And he tells you something negative. The Chofetz Chaim says, and we'll repeat this many times, you're not allowed to believe it as fact. You can take it into consideration. It's a possibility, and because of that possibility, I'm going to stay away. But you're not allowed to accept it as a fact. If you accept it as a fact, that's called Kabbalas Lashon Hara. That's called accepting Lashon Hara. So even though he said what the person told you he's allowed to say, you were allowed to hear what he said, you can't accept it as a fact. You can only take it into consideration. That means it could be, it's a possibility. I don't have to take chances, and therefore I'll stay away. And also, there's no. First of all, there's no suspicion about you trying to, speak lashon hara, and you're also not going to be causing someone else to stumble. If you make somebody else speak lashon hara, you are transgressing the prohibition of lifnei ivlei sitein michshol, for a blind person to put a stumbling block. That includes causing someone to do a sin. Einu ois b'zeh iser gamkein, kemishagam hu ena miskav mitshuvas l'sapa genusa shal chaverei raku oimer ha'emes b'chtei lahetiv imzah asher me'itoy eitzim inyan zeh. The point is that person is not going to go ahead and be transgressing anything wrong, because the same way you can inquire because you're trying to help yourself, he can respond to help you. So, but the point is, if you don't tell him why you're doing it, he's just thinking he's giving over bad information. That means he's speaking lashon hara, and you've caused him to do that. So by going ahead and now letting him know why you're doing this, you cover any kind of suspicion against you and any kind of causing him to sin. Have a wonderful day and a good Shabbos.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.